Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us today for our very last seminar of the semester. It is my pleasure to introduce Karin Leiderman. Karin is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Statistics at Colorado School of Mines. Her research focuses on mathematical modeling of biochemical systems involving biological fluid dynamics and numerical methods for low Reynolds number flows. So today she will share with us some of the related work about the hydrodynamical coupling of flagella on a spherical body. Karin.
Okay, so let me share my screen here. Let's make sure this works. Okay, can everybody see my screen? All right, oops, hold on, put it back. I just want to make this thing go away. Hide floating meeting. Okay, so if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. And oh, look, it still says Siam meeting on there. Sorry about that. I'm using, it's a similar talk I gave at Siam, but I did enhance it a little bit for this talk. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's nice to meet some of you who I've never met before. Nice to see Thomas again. I haven't seen him for a while. We were just talking about how we haven't seen each other in a couple of years since a real live conference. And I think before he got the job at Brandeis. So that's great that he's there. And there's a supportive group of math bio people. So yeah, my work has mostly been focused on blood clotting for a really long time, but as sort of a side interest that is in parallel with blood clotting is fluid dynamics. And I sort of gone off on these different tangents looking at fluids, and in particular, I've worked on a method called the method of regularized Stokeslets, which I'm going to talk more about in this talk. But a couple of years ago, I had a postdoc who came and was really interested in looking at Volvox, and that's an algae that I'm going to talk about today, what you see here on the slide. And so this is a project that stemmed from his interest, and then we also recruited a undergraduate here, Mika Jarvella, who did a lot of the work on this project as well. So Forrest Mannon was the postdoc that worked on this, and he is now an assistant professor at Western Colorado. And Mika is now a software development engineer at Amazon, but he was funded on our Mines undergraduate research fellowship to do this work. And then it was published last year in Phys Review E. So I'm just gonna highlight what we did in this project and some of the results. Okay. So Volvox is a multicellular green algae, seen here, whose surface consists of thousands of fairly regularly spaced biflagellated somatic cells that are embedded in their extracellular matrix. They're about 200 microns in radius, and it's well known that they coordinate their flagella to swim and dance, move toward light, etc. And here's a really nice movie. I don't know. Oh, can you see my mouse here? Oh, good, you can see my mouse. So here's a really beautiful movie of them dancing, where you can see them forward swimming, and you can also see these whole body rotations, right? So they are a remarkable organism, and they're also ideal for studying these coordinated flagellar flows. Okay, so Volvox have been intriguing scientists for a long time, for decades, and we now have a lot of experimental measurements because of that. And observations that have been collected. Some of the major features that we know are that, one, all of the flagella, they all beat toward the colony's posterior in a nearly planar waveform. We know that the plane of beating is offset by some angle that is believed to allow the Volvox to rotate or swirl. But one of the motivating questions that we had when we were developing this model that I'm going to tell you about is to really sort of verify that this tilt in the plane of beating, if that really enables the rotations, if that's really part of the mechanism of enabling the rotations. Okay, so to understand this, I'm gonna just do like a brief summary of some of the experimental observations that we know and talk about how Volvox behavior is visualized and analyzed. So researchers can hold a single Volvox with a micropipette. That's these black, now you can't see my mouse anymore. Well, the little black bars there on the picture, it's like the end of a micropipette, okay? And then they can use particle image velocimetry to visualize the flows that the flagella are generating. And in particular, you can visualize the velocity vectors and compute their magnitude. So then the magnitude of the vectors can be time averaged as shown here on the right. And then the flow field can be described well, and this is what was shown in some of these papers. The flow field is described well by what's called a squirmer model of a spherical swimmer. Okay, and some of you might be familiar with that terminology. Additionally, what else can you do with these velocity fields? Well, you can decompose a velocity into a radial and tangential component, and then you can plot these over time. So here you see some of the snapshots through time where you can see like the disturbance that's propagating toward the posterior of the organism. So you can see how the blue is moving downward as time is going, read from left to right time, and then you can see the disturbance is moving toward the back or the posterior. The radial velocity measurements can then be graphed on what is known as a kymograph. That's here on the bottom right, which if you record the velocity from 0 to pi, then take that and straighten it out vertically and plot it over and over through time. Then that's how you produce this kymograph. And then the diagonals here on the kymograph indicate that there's a metachronal wave such that the radial velocity is being propagated as a wave from the front to the back of the organism. So some questions that emerge, right, are how does the wave itself emerge? Is it purely hydrodynamic? And can we use a simple model of coupled oscillating rotors to answer this question? And, you know, can it emerge on the surface of a sphere? What is known about that? Has anybody looked at that before?
Corinne, just a question about the architecture of these, of these waves. Should we be imagining kind of almost like at a fixed latitude, these sort of bands of cilia, or is it also kind of diagonal? And is that why this diagonal is sort of disrupted on the kymographs, because it's wrapping out of the plane?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And certainly in reality, right, they're not just going to be these perfect bands, but I mean, you do see these beautiful waves that do emerge kind of down as if there were like just bands around the latitudes. But as you'll see in some of the movies that I'm going to show at the end, you do start getting these nice swirls that go kind of diagonal. And I don't want to give the punchline. Well, I'll give the punchline. It's when you have this tilt in the plane of the beating. So it really does kind of depend on the location and the tilt and sort of the sort of orientation of each of the little flagella, essentially. But for forward motion, you do want this sort of propagation of the wave from the top to the bottom, essentially. Okay. So it turns out that these ideas have been carried out for scenarios that simplify the spherical surface to be a plane. Okay, so we're going to build on some previous work where the spherical surface itself was just thought of as like a flat surface, so not an actual sphere. Okay, so I'm going to briefly summarize what's been done in this regard, since we're going to be following this method pretty closely, and some of the basic information needed about the fluid dynamics that will be used for the models. So here's a schematic of the minimal model of Brumley, Poland, Pedley, and Goldstein, this was a paper in PRL in 2012. And here's an image of one flagellum on the left, with the red circle tracing out the tip of the flagellum as it beats. So you can see it's like this circular motion. Okay, so the model essentially uses what are called rotors to represent that circular motion. So it's just a tiny sphere that's moving around and sort of tracing out that circle. The rotor is it's a sphere and it moves in a preferred orbit. Okay, and it moves in that preferred orbit by being elastically bound to a circular trajectory. Okay, so it wants to be in a circle, but it can go out of that circle and it can move according to some elasticity. And it's perpendicular to a wall, and it has a driving force that's tangential to the trajectory that it's moving. And then the rotor is also moving in a low Reynolds number fluid. Okay, so very viscous fluid. So let me talk a little bit about that. So low Reynolds number flows are governed by the Stokes equation shown here and can be thought of as a balance of forces related to pressure, viscosity, and external forces acting on the system, which in this particular equation is described as a single point force at the origin, which has been modeled with the direct delta function. Okay, so we assume that this fluid is incompressible via the divergence-free constraint. That's the second equation there. And that the velocity decays to zero as we move away from the origin. So these equations are also linear, and so we can discuss and find their fundamental solution. So to do this, I'll just kind of walk through the process of that real quick. To do this, we can use that divergence-free constraint and apply it to the first equation, sometimes called the momentum equation. And we can solve the resulting Poisson equation for the pressure, and then we plug that pressure back into the momentum equation. And then we can use the fundamental solution to the Laplacian and the biharmonic to then write down the fundamental solution using the appropriate boundary conditions at infinity. And with that, we arrive at an expression for the velocity shown here on the slide, where r is simply the distance between the evaluation point x, where you're looking at the velocity, and the origin, where the point force is. Okay. And notice that there's this 1/r singularity present in this formulation. Okay, so we can also place the point force at any arbitrary position y in the field, right? And then we just write the expression in terms of the free space Green's function, which is often called the Stokeslets. Okay, so for our example with the rotors, if the rotor was at point y, then this formula in free space would tell us how the rotor is affecting the velocity at a point x. Okay, that's sort of the setup here. So now let's recall that the rotors are placed above a wall. So this must also be taken into account, right? Because we're not in free space. We have to consider that there's this wall that is affecting the fluid and the motion of the rotor itself. Okay, so we want the velocity to be zero at the wall. We call this the no slip condition. And so we can use a technique for linear PDEs where we can add solutions to the PDE and derivatives of the solution that enforce a desired boundary condition. And this is called using images or creating an image system. So for a point above the wall, we can formulate the image system by placing an exact image Stokelet across the wall and some other derivatives of that solution to enforce the desired boundary condition. So this was actually done long before us by Blake back in 1971. And this formulation is widely used for any sorts of like problems where you have a wall in a low Reynolds number fluid, or I should say fluid next to a wall. Okay, so let's put all these ideas together. We talked a little bit about the rotor. We talked a little bit about the fluid. At least we talked about the rotors in words. So now let's talk about what that means mathematically and see how it all works together. So the sphere's velocity follows the force balance requirement of Stokes flow that states that the total force acting on the sphere is zero. So the forces acting on the sphere are going to be in the sphere that's in the rotor, like the sphere that is the rotor that's moving, not the big sphere of the Volvox, but okay. So the forces acting on the little sphere are the spring force that keeps it connected to the center of the circle, another spring force to keep the sphere moving in a planar motion, the driving force that pushes the sphere, and then the drag force from the fluid itself, okay, that's acting on the fluid. The forces from the fluid can be approximated as drag on a sphere in Stokes flow, and that's shown here and denoted as the friction tensor, okay? All right, so when there are multiple rotors that are interacting, then we simply just add on those interactions into the force balance, okay? And you have to take those into account since each one is now having an effect on all the other rotors. Okay, so the effect that one rotor has on another can be represented by a single Stokelet and its image system to account for the wall. The velocities of the rotors are unknown, right? So we don't know what those are. They're acting on each other. I mean, we're giving them some prescribed motion, but we don't know how all the interactions are going to make what the emergent velocity is going to look like. So the velocities are unknown. So the force balances provide us with the linear system that we solve for the velocities. And then these instantaneous velocities are used to update the positions of the rotors. And then we just iterate that forward as sort of the model, okay, for a simulation. So I'll briefly go over some of the results from the Brumley model. So in 2012, they performed a fairly rigorous study for 2 rotors. And so here I'm going to summarize the results. There's kind of a lot on the slide, so let me talk through it. So for 2 rotors, it was shown that no matter what the initial conditions were, or the initial locations in terms of where they are in their circular trajectory, that they always converge to a steady state phase difference. Okay, and this is shown in the plot on the left, where they're plotting the phase differences as a function of the number of beats. So this is the plot on the bottom left. So it's plotted as a function of the number of beats or full rotations of the rotor. That's another way to think about the beat. And you can see that they always end at a phase difference of minus 0.17. Okay, that number isn't necessarily like super important, but the point is that it goes to some constant. So then they increase the number of rotors to make a chain of 30 of them. And remember, again, this is above a plane, right? So we have a chain of 30 rotors, and they performed a similar simulation. And what they're showing here on the bottom, or what I'm showing, is the resulting chymograph. So remember, we talked about this chymograph in time. So you should be thinking that this is kind of similar to what we saw with the actual experiments. So the rotor phase is plotted in color, and the rotor number is on the y-axis, and time is on the x-axis. Okay, so you can clearly see that we get this diagonal behavior, which emerges as what we know to be the metachronal waves. That's what we saw before. Okay, so at first they're just kind of all doing whatever, and then all of a sudden they go to this constant, they have this constant neighboring phase difference. You can see the phase difference in the bottom plot, where everything goes to that like same color at the end of time. And you see that sort of diagonal where there's this sort of wave that will be like over the top of the rotors in the line. Okay. All right. So there was a couple of other studies that I'll just briefly mention. So another work by similar authors, some of the same authors, Pedley, Brumley, and Goldstein, also looked at what they called a swirling envelope model. Okay, and here they treated the flow around the Volvox as being driven by the displacement of a stretching flexible sheet that was attached to the tips of the flagella. Okay, and also moving along with them. And to do this, they extended the model of Lighthill and Blake to include a swirl. And that consisted of an axisymmetric swirl velocities and azimuthal displacements. So this model was shown to underestimate the swimming speeds and angular velocities by quite a bit from the actual experiments. But it also couldn't allow for studying the coordination of the individual flagella. So we wanted something, right? I mean, this was a really cool study, and they showed some really interesting result, but we wanted to be able to look at the individual coordination level of the flagella. And so we decided to go with the rotor model instead. And then there's another study that looked at rotors exterior to a sphere by Nasouri and Elfring from 2016. And here they used a rotor model with simplified asymptotic expressions for the motion and the resulting velocities. And this was achievable because there was this underlying assumption in their model that the rotors around the sphere all beat in the same direction. Okay, so they were able to make some certain simplifications due to that. So they found that all the rotors had a 0 phase difference in steady state, and that there was no metachronal wave. So due to the directional assumption, though, the model cannot address questions about the Volvox flagella because we know that they beat in different directions toward the pole. All right, so let's return to this idea of the flagella on Volvox, as I said, where they're on the surface of a sphere and they beat in different directions. So our goal was to build a minimal model of rotors on the exterior of a sphere that can be used to explore the hydrodynamic coupling, the metachronism, and also determine if the tilt of the flagella affects the outcome of the beating and the wave. Okay, how am I doing on time? All right, I gotta probably speed it up. Okay, so we're gonna continue talking about Stokeslets, but I'm now gonna talk a little more about a numerical method known as the method of regularized Stokeslets, and I mentioned this before. So recall, I mentioned there was this 1/r singularity in the Stokeslets that we saw before. So to regularize this, what we're going to do here is replace the Dirac delta function with essentially a smoothed out version of it. And then we'll apply the same solution technique as before to arrive at a Green's function without the singularity. Okay, and then from here, so this is in free space again, and from here, we're going to move on to this formulation on the sphere. Okay, so the basic idea is to replace the force from one rotor acting on another rotor with a Stokelet and an image system that accounts for the surface of the sphere. So here we've chosen to use the regularized version of the Stokelet outside of a sphere. And this particular formulation was developed by Roble, Cortez, and Varela and Fauci in 2016. But what I did want to point out also is that there is another formulation of this for the non-regularized version by Saverio Spagnoli and some other authors in 2015. And you know, you could use that system with the original system from Brumley, but we chose to use the regularized version just because it's sort of common in our group and we had the codes to do it. And I don't know how similar the results would be, but I imagine they're probably quite similar using either method. But just pointing out that there is, if one did want to use the non-singular version or non-regularized version, excuse me, you can go and read this beautiful paper here. Saverio always writes really nice papers. So, okay. So what else do I need to say? These are the incompressible Stokes equations here. So now we have this capital F, and embedded in that are all of the rotors and the forces acting on the fluid from the rotors. Okay, so let's move on. All right, so once we've replaced the singular Stokelet with our regularized Stokelet around it for fluid around a sphere, we can now follow these algorithmic steps to perform our simulations. Okay, so first we place them along the spherical surface. All of our rotors, we place them. And I can talk about how we did that if you want to know later. And then we will solve for the instantaneous velocity of each rotor using the linear system of force balance equations that I talked about before. And then we just use these velocities to update the position of each rotor, and we repeat, right? That's how the simulations are made. All right, so this is a short video that's just going to orient you to how we're going to be tracking the rotors and their phases for the rest of the talk. And we went through so many different ways of how to do this, right? Especially like, what's the angle that we're going to track from on the rotor? And different people do different things. So we just wanted to make it really clear how we are tracking it. So here we're going to consider the orientation of the rotor as shown on the left, where the phase angle defined at 0 at the location normal to the surface and through the center of the circular trajectory. Okay, so that's going to be our 0 angle. And then the evolution of the phase can be visualized on the plots on the right as time goes forward. All right, so that's what the different colors are going to mean that we're going to see in the chymographs, is really just looking at sort of its location in its circle. Okay, or in it's not really, it doesn't have to be a circle, it can be some other shape, but through its rotation. Okay, so then we're going to be showing you a bunch of chymographs, and so it's good to just get oriented to that here as well. So on the top, this is just kind of a test. So on the top, you're going to see 30 blue dots. Okay, and that's the center of each rotor. And it's kind of funny to the eye. It doesn't look like it's a straight line of blue dots, but it is. And then the red dots are the position of each rotor. Okay, and so you can see that they're all in a different phase. So the phases of the rotor in that chain can then be converted to a color, as we showed on the last slide, and then plotted in a chymograph where the rotor numbers on the y-axis and the number of beats is on the x-axis. So the specific snapshot of the rotors on the top there is then really translated into the vertical line in the chymograph at the red dashed line. Okay, does that make sense? So it's really a way to track all of the locations, like all in one place. So this was really helpful for me when we were working on this, like how are we going to look at these results? And so I thought it would just be nice to kind of orient everyone with an example, since we're going to be looking at the chymographs a bunch. Okay, so first let's look at a chain of rotors on the surface of the sphere, where the first rotor is at the top of the sphere and the last rotor is on the bottom of the sphere. And we're just going to look at it on one side. Okay, so when I think here we have 30 rotors, yeah, because it says 1 to 30. Okay, so here's a resulting kymograph from a random initial condition. And on the left is the first 20 beats. And on the right is what we see after 100 beats and when we've gotten to a steady state. So you can see that we have this wave. Okay, now let's compare these to a chain of rotors on the surface of a plane. So we recomputed this ourselves on a plane using the regularized methods as well, but just to do like a quick comparison. And so again, first 20 beats on the left and then steady state on the right. And you can see that the behavior is really similar, right? So whether you have one on the surface of a sphere or on a flat plane, you can see that the same qualitative behavior is occurring. All right, this behavior is further quantified if you plot the final waveform for a sphere, for whether you're on a sphere or a plane after 1,000 beats. And the phases in both the plane and the sphere case evolve similarly, though the final waveform in the sphere exhibits a greater total variation in the phase difference. That is, on the surface of the sphere, there's a slightly greater phase difference between each of the adjacent rotors, but there's slightly, different distance, but that's the major difference between them. Okay, but now we want to place thousands of rotors near the sphere's surface. So how do we place them? And I did mention this a little bit ago, but I'll go into a little more detail. So on the Volvox, the cells are not placed along meridians, right? They're really not lines. Like what I just showed you was we were just looking at a test case of a line of these rotors. So we're going to assume that the somatic cells on the surface are roughly equally spaced to represent this for our simulations. And if you didn't know this, it's actually kind of hard to put points on a sphere that are equally spaced. There's like not a good way to do that. So we use this package called for spherical centroidal Voronoi tessellation with a special package called STREPAC. So what we did is we distributed 1,257 rotors on the surface of the sphere with the distance of approximately twice the distance from the center of the rotor to the sphere surface. Okay, so the center of the rotation, so about 2 of that is where we place another rotor next to it. Okay, so let's look at some simulations of this situation. Okay, so starting with random initial conditions, we evolved the 1,257 rotors in time and found this really beautiful collective behavior. So this is just the initial behavior, and it does take a little while for the coordination to start, but after a while, you can see this really nice long-term behavior, and you can see this nice metachronal wave that propagates from the top of the bottom, from the top of the sphere to the bottom of the sphere. And so you can see, so what we're plotting on the left, I'm not going to remember the name of these plots. It starts with an E, and I don't remember it, but it's something that's commonly used for people that study like Earth weather and stuff, and it's a way to just map the surface of a sphere like to this oval. So what we're seeing on the left is actually all of the points that are on the sphere sort of mapped out onto this little oval. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the type of plot, but the point is that with uniform spacing, we see this really nice wave that emerges after some time, right? So there's clearly some coordination. All right, so previous minimal rotor models of flagellar coordination used regularly spaced rotors, whether along a chain or a 2-dimensional ray. And this allowed for really straightforward computations and comparisons of the phase differences, right? So we talked about that, and it was easy when they're in a chain, but now we don't have these nice linear chains. So we still want to be able to quantify, their steady state a little bit more than just the eyeball method, which you can see that they were clearly, coordinated, but we wanted to do something a little more quantitative. So with approximately uniform distributions of rotors on the surface, right, we don't have these exact linear chains. So to look at the trends in the rotor phases in the equatorial and the meridional direction, we created chains of idealized rotors in each direction. So let me explain what that means. So the idealized rotors in these chains are placed at equidistant points along the true equator and meridians, which are shown in the blue dots. Okay, shown in the red dots. And then the phase for each of the idealized rotors is then computed by sampling and averaging the phases of the actual rotors that are within a neighborhood around them, which are shown in the blue dots. So like in the top figure there, the red idealized rotor in a linear chain is just essentially like an average of the phases of the neighboring guys, okay? So And we just made this up. I mean, it was the best thing that we could come up with. Maybe there are other ways to do it, but this seemed to work for us. Okay, and then and so that's how we computed our idealized chains of rotors. And then to better quantify the collective dynamics, we followed a study by Wolin and Stark, where we computed the complex order parameter for the idealized rotors in the meridional and equatorial directions. So if we let the neighboring phase differences of the idealized rotors be given as follows here with the phi bar expression, then the complex order parameter is computed as the mean of the phasors. So a complex order parameter near 0, or here if A is approximately 0, means that the phases are random. Okay, and if it's near 1, or if A is near 1, then that means that there is some stable metachronism, where the pairs of the neighboring rotors are phase locked with the same phase difference. Okay, so this just gives us a quantitative measure of the coordination of the flagella. So for the equatorial computation, we computed one idealized chain of rotors and computed the order parameter. And we found that the amplitude was 0.99 and the polar angle was practically 0. So this means that there was metachronism, but with no phase difference between the rotors around the equator. Okay, so that means that they were all essentially beating exactly the same if you look right around the equator. Okay. This can also be seen in the top chymograph here, where if we draw a vertical line, right, anywhere along the graph, we'll see that the phase difference doesn't change. But in contrast, there's different behavior in the meridional direction. I know I'm not saying that word right either, but it's okay. I'm going to keep saying it the same. So since there are many choices for the location of the chain, again, looking at the meridians, right, there's only one, so there's only one place for the equator, but for the looking at the meridians, we randomly selected 200 meridional chains, and then we computed their average order parameter. And we found again that the order parameter was very close to 1, but the polar angle was now non-zero. And this indicates a stable metachronal wave in the meridional direction. Okay. Does that make sense? So we do see a wave going from top to bottom, and around the equator, everybody's moving the same, which makes sense. There should be no wave, right? Because everybody's moving this way. The wave goes top to bottom, and it's nicely quantified with these numbers. All right, so recall then that it's known that the flagellar beat has some tilt out of the meridional plane, and it's estimated that it's maybe 10 to 20 degrees out of that plane. So they're observed to swim with a consistent rotational spin, and it's thought that that tilt is what helps them swim that way. Okay, so can we use this model to sort of understand that or answer that question? Is that offset in the plane really allowing or causing that rotation? Okay, so the tilt can be prescribed within the context of our present minimal model of rotors just by altering the normal vector that determines the plane in which the preferred orbits are situated on the surface. Okay, so we proceeded by selecting this normal vector for each rotor to have a 15, we chose 15, the middle, 15-degree tilt from the respective meridional plane. And then we quantify the dynamics of those evolving rotors, similar to what we did with the last case. Okay, so we ran 100 simulations with random initial conditions, and we got some kind of interesting results. So interestingly, 6 of those simulations reached a steady state that exhibited this symplectic metachronal wave that traveled diagonally from the anterior to the posterior, okay? Or diagonally to the anterior posterior axis, I should say, because it's like diagonal across that axis. And the rest of them didn't do that. They just had the same kind of behavior that we saw before, but there were a few that did show this behavior. So one of these cases is shown here with the snapshots of the evolution of the wave. And again, we wanted to better quantify this. So we used the complex order parameter again to do that. So you can, here are the chymographs for the 2 directions where you can clearly see that there's a wave in both directions now, right? In the equatorial and in the meridional, which those together make the diagonal wave. And then computing the order parameter again matches our intuition, which gives us amplitudes near 1 and non-zero polar angles, which suggests that there's metachronal waves in both directions. and leads to the overall diagonally directed wave. So we believe that this leads to rotation and swirl. And to better understand that, we also examine the velocity induced in the surrounding fluid. So just as the influence that one rotor has on another can be estimated using the far field approximation of the Stokeslet and its image system for a spherical geometry, the fluid flow away from the Volvox body can also be estimated by summing the far field approximations of the fluid induced on each rotor. Okay. So here I'm showing the velocity averaged over one full period that is induced in the surrounding fluid when the rotor's preferred orbit is in that 15-degree tilt. Okay. And on the left is the fluid velocity in the meridional plane. And on the right is the azimuthal fluid velocity in the plane that coincides with the equator of the Volvox. Okay, so it's like looking around the equator of the Volvox. So you should be seeing things like moving around this way. The white circle represents the Volvox body, and the white line demarcates a distance of 20 microns from the surface. So the velocities within this line are set to 0 since the far field approximations would not be applicable in that range. So we discarded those. The tilt in the rotor orbits creates a clear swirling motion. And you can see that, right? Because when we're looking at the velocity around the equator, everything's turning this way. So you can see that there's like this rotation of the fluid. So it's moving down from the posterior to the anterior, and then it's also moving around the equator. So that is a clear swirling motion. So that was pretty cool. And we don't see that with without the tilt, right? So without the tilt, you don't get the swirling motion. I probably should have shown that on here. But okay, so sort of in conclusion here, we use the method of regularized Stokeslets together with a simple rotor model to represent the flagellum tips on the surface of a sphere. And we found that the model could exhibit this large scale coordination. We modeled the flagella such that they all beat toward one pole. And we found that when the rotors are approximately uniformly spaced, we see coordination in a direction toward the posterior. And with tilt, we see the diagonal metachronal waves that indicate this rotational swirling motion. We use the order parameters to quantify and verify the collective metachronal wave behavior. And then in the future, which I hope that Forrest is going to keep working on this. He's got a couple undergrad students that I know he's recruited. So hopefully there will still be more work to come. But in the future, we would like to look at non-circular trajectories, look at different densities around the surface of these flagella, and then apply this to phototaxis. So some pictures on the right. This is actually pretty cool because it looks like the beat forms change depending on whether or not they're in light. And so that should help them move toward the light because that's the observation. And so I think it would be really cool to be able to modify the shape of those orbits in different regions of the sphere and just see how that changes the fluid and see how that changes the motion. And then they think that there may be like higher densities of these flagella on the anterior versus the posterior. And so looking at different densities on different parts of the sphere, I think would be interesting too. I don't know how that helps them, but maybe it helps them, you know, in steering or some sort of stability. I'm not sure. Lots of different things to look at. So with that, I will end and thank you so much for listening, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Well, thank you very much for such a nice talk. I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions so that Karin have time to prepare for her teaching. So
yeah, sorry, I mentioned this before. I do have to teach right at the hour, so I'll probably need to leave a few minutes before, but
sure.
We have a little bit of time. So
do we have any questions?
I had one. So this number, kind of 1247 or whatever it was, the number of the rotors that you ended up putting on the sphere, why did you choose that particular number? Did you find that sort of this metachronal behavior only emerges once you have enough of them, or could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some estimate of the numbers on the surface. I think the actual number is a little closer to 2,000, but we chose it. I don't remember why that number specifically. It had to do with ensuring like a twice the distance, like the spacing between each rotor, and then we wanted to really stick to the dimensions of the rotors that were used in the Brumley paper. So to use the dimensions that they had and the lengths and the sizes, when we put it onto the sphere, it just turned out to be that number. So we just figured it was in the thousands, and it gave us the spacing that we wanted. It wasn't a super special number. Yeah, so.
Yeah, it's really beautiful how you see that wave pattern emerge.
Yeah, thanks.
Alrighty, I think we can wrap up here for today. I'd like to thank our speaker Karin again, and everyone for your participation and support throughout the semester. So I hope you all have a wonderful holiday, and see you soon in the spring. Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming.
Sure. I don't know how to get out of this.